Sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you become the very ones who deliver you to the wolves. Hello, my beautiful souls. My name is Angel, but most folks around here just call me Grandma Angel. I'm 72 years old, born and raised in the small town of Riverside, Ohio, back in 1952. Today I want to share with you a story that I've carried in my heart like a stone for over 50 years. A story about betrayal so deep it nearly destroyed me. About silence that almost killed me. And about finding light in the darkest places imaginable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Riverside in the 1960s was like living in a Norman Rockwell painting, at least from the outside. Tree-lined streets where children rode their bicycles until the streetlights came on, white picket fences, and the smell of apple pie cooling on kitchen windowsills. Our little town sat along the Miami River, surrounded by cornfields that stretched as far as the eye could see. Everyone knew everyone, and Sunday church was as mandatory as breathing. I was the youngest of 3 children born to Robert and Margaret Thompson. My father worked at the local auto parts factory, a job he'd held since returning from Korea in 1953. He was what people called a man's man, tall, broad-shouldered, with calloused hands and a voice that could fill a room. When he walked into Murphy's Tavern after his shift, men would slap his back and buy him drinks. When he sat in our front porch rocker on summer evenings, neighbors would stop to chat about the weather, the Cincinnati Reds, and politics. My mother Margaret was the picture of 1960s domesticity. She wore house dresses with small floral patterns, kept her brown hair in neat curls, and could stretch a dollar further than anyone in Riverside. She sang while she hung laundry on the line, hummed hymns while she kneaded bread dough, and always had a kind word for the mailman or the milk delivery boy. To the outside world, we were the perfect American family. But houses can hide terrible secrets behind their cheerful facades. I was 8 years old when I first understood that something was fundamentally wrong in our home. It was a humid July evening in 1960, and the cicadas were singing their summer song outside my bedroom window. I had been sent to bed early, as usual, while my older brothers Tommy and James got to stay up watching television with the adults. From my room, I could hear the rumble of men's voices and the clink of beer bottles. My father had friends over again. This happened frequently, especially on weekends. Men from the factory, men from church, men from the American Legion post where my father spent most Saturday afternoons. They would gather in our living room, sometimes spilling out onto the back porch, talking loudly about work, sports, and things I was too young to understand. That night, I heard my father's voice calling my name. "Angel, honey, come down here for a minute." I padded down the creaky wooden stairs in my cotton nightgown, my bare feet silent on the cool linoleum. Kitchen floor. The living room was thick with cigarette smoke, and I counted 4 men besides my father. Mr. Peterson from down the street, Mr. Walsh who worked with my father, Pastor Williams from our church, and a man I didn't recognize with greasy black hair and eyes that made my stomach feel funny. "There's my little princess," my father said, his words slightly slurred. He'd been drinking. I could tell by the way his smile seemed too wide, too loose. "Come here and say hello to my friends." I approached cautiously, the way you might approach a dog you weren't sure about. The men were looking at me in a way that made my skin crawl, though I couldn't have articulated why at 8 years old. It was the stranger with the black hair who spoke first. "She's a pretty little thing, Bob. Real pretty." My father's chest puffed with pride. "That's my baby girl. Smart as a whip, too. Angel, why don't you give Mr. Crawford here a hug? He's driven all the way from Columbus to visit." Something inside me recoiled. Everything in my young body was screaming no. But I had been raised to be obedient, to never question adults, to always do what my father said. So I stepped forward, and Mr. Crawford's arms closed around me like a trap. His hands moved in ways they shouldn't have. His touch lingered where it had no business being. And when I tried to pull away, my father's voice cut through my instinctive fear. "Don't be rude, Angel. Mr. Crawford is being nice to you." That was the beginning of my nightmare, though I wouldn't understand the full scope of what was happening for several more years. That night set a pattern that would define my childhood. My father would invite his friends over, they would drink, and eventually, I would be called downstairs. Sometimes it was just uncomfortable touching. Sometimes it was worse. Much worse. The other men rotated, but Mr. Crawford became a regular fixture in our home. He was a supervisor at a manufacturing plant in Columbus, divorced, with adult children he rarely mentioned. He had money, which impressed my father, and a car that was newer and shinier than anything else on our street. He also had appetites that my father was willing to enable in exchange for what I now understand were loans, job opportunities, and social connections. My mother knew something was wrong. I'm sure of it now, though at the time I thought she was simply oblivious. But I remember the way she would find reasons to be away from the house when my father's friends came over. Suddenly she needed groceries, or had to visit her sister, or had church committee meetings that ran late into the evening. She developed a talent for making herself scarce, leaving me alone with the wolves. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When I tried to tell her what was happening, her responses were always variations of the same theme. "Don't make up stories, Angel. You're being dramatic. Your father's friends are respectable men. Little girls shouldn't tell tales." The message was clear. I would not be believed, I would not be protected, and I was on my own. The abuse escalated gradually. What started as inappropriate touching progressed to worse violations. Mr. Crawford would take me to the basement, telling my father we were going to look at his new tools or help him fix something that was broken. The basement was unfinished, with a concrete floor and exposed beams. It smelled of motor oil and dampness, and it became the setting for horrors that no child should ever endure. Sometimes other men participated. Sometimes they just watched. Sometimes they took pictures with a camera that Mr. Crawford kept in a leather case. I learned to leave my body during these times, to float somewhere near the ceiling, and watch what was happening to the little girl below as if she were someone else entirely. The physical pain was excruciating, but the emotional devastation was worse. This was my father, the man who was supposed to protect me, literally selling access to my body in exchange for favors. He would stand at the top of the basement stairs, drinking his beer and making jokes with whoever remained upstairs, while his friends violated his daughter in the room below. "She's a good girl," I heard him tell Mr. Crawford one evening after a particularly brutal session. "Knows how to keep her mouth shut. Smart kid." At school, I became withdrawn and anxious. My grades dropped, and I stopped participating in activities I had once enjoyed. I developed chronic stomach aches and headaches that would send me to the nurse's office several times a week. Mrs. Rodriguez, my third-grade teacher, pulled me aside one day after class. "Angel, honey, is everything all right at home? You seem different lately." I wanted to tell her. The words were right there, pressing against my teeth like caged birds desperate to fly. But my father's warnings echoed in my head. "If you ever tell anyone about our private family business, bad things will happen to your mother, bad things will happen to your brothers, and nobody will believe you anyway, because who's going to take the word of a little girl over respectable men like us?" So I lied. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Rodriguez. I just have a stomach ache." She looked at me for a long moment, her brown eyes soft with concern. "You know you can tell me anything, right? If someone is hurting you, if someone is doing things that don't feel right, you can tell me." I nodded and mumbled something about being late for the bus. That was the closest I ever came to telling an adult the truth during those terrible years. The abuse continued through my elementary school years and into middle school. Mr. Crawford remained the primary predator, but others cycled through our basement over the years. Some were men from my father's work, others were acquaintances from church or the American Legion. All of them knew they had my father's protection and my enforced silence. I developed coping mechanisms that would take decades to unlearn. I became hypervigilant, constantly scanning for danger, reading the mood of every room I entered. I learned to make myself invisible, to speak quietly, to take up as little space as possible. I stopped eating enough, hoping that if I got thin, enough, small enough, maybe I would disappear entirely. My relationship with my mother became increasingly strained. Part of me hated her for her willful blindness, for the way she abandoned me to my fate every time she left the house when the men were coming over. But part of me also desperately craved her protection, her love, some sign that she cared about what was happening to her daughter. One evening when I was 12, I found her folding laundry in the basement the morning after one of my father's gatherings. The room still smelled of cigarettes and something else I couldn't name. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, watching her sort socks and undershirts with mechanical precision. "Mama," I said quietly, "do you know what happens down here?" Her hands stilled for just a moment, a white undershirt clutched in her fingers. Then she resumed folding, her movements more aggressive than before. "I know that little girls who ask too many questions get into trouble," she said without looking at me. "And I know that your father works hard to provide for this family. And we don't question the way he chooses to entertain his friends." It was the closest she ever came to acknowledging what was happening, and it was also a clear message that I was utterly alone in this nightmare. By the time I reached high school, I was a shadow of the bright, curious child I had once been. I had no close friends, struggled academically, and lived in a constant state of fear and hyperarousal. The abuse had taken on a routine quality that was almost worse than the initial shock. Every few weeks, my father would have his gatherings, and I would be expected to participate in ways that violated every boundary a child should have. Mr. Crawford had grown bolder over the years, sometimes staying overnight in our guest room, sometimes taking me places outside our home. He had convinced my father that I needed special tutoring in mathematics, which gave him a reason to pick me up after school once or twice a week. These tutoring sessions took place in a small apartment he rented across town, and they had nothing to do with mathematics. The psychological manipulation was as devastating as the physical abuse. Mr. Crawford would tell me that I was special, that I was mature for my age, that what we were doing was normal and healthy. He would buy me small gifts, a hair ribbon, a candy bar, a cheap necklace, and tell me these were rewards for being such a good girl. He convinced me that I was complicit, that I wanted these things to happen, that I was somehow responsible for the horrible things he did to my body. My father reinforced this narrative. "You're lucky Mr. Crawford takes such an interest in you," he would say. "Not every girl gets this kind of special attention. You should be grateful." Grateful. For years, I actually believed I should be grateful for being systematically abused by adult men, while my father counted the money and favors he received in exchange. It wasn't until I was 16 that I finally found the courage to resist. Mr. Crawford had been drinking more heavily than usual during one of his visits, and he became rougher, more violent than he had ever been before. Something in me snapped that night. As he pinned me down in that terrible basement, I looked up at the exposed beams and made a decision. I was going to survive this, and I was going to find a way out. The next morning, I went to school with bruises I couldn't hide, and a determination I had never felt before. I sought out Mrs. Patterson, the school counselor, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Mrs. Patterson," I said, closing her office door behind me, "I need help. Someone has been hurting me for a very long time, and I can't take it anymore." The words tumbled out in a rush, 8 years of horror spilling from my lips like poison. that had finally found its way to the surface. I told her about Mr. Crawford, about the other men, about my father's complicity, about my mother's deliberate ignorance. I told her about the basement, the cameras, the money that changed hands, the threats that kept me silent for so long. Mrs. Patterson listened without interruption, her face growing paler with each detail I revealed. When I finished, she reached across her desk and took my trembling hands in hers. "Angel," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I am so sorry this happened to you. None of this was your fault. None of it. And we are going to make sure it never happens again." That afternoon, Mrs. Patterson called Child Protective Services. By evening, police officers were at our front door. The investigation that followed tore our family apart, but it also set me free. Mr. Crawford was arrested within a week. During the search of his apartment, police found photographs, films, and evidence of abuse involving not just me, but several other children over the years. My father was charged as an accomplice, an enabler. Several of his other friends were investigated, though not all of them faced charges due to lack of evidence and the passage of time. The trial was a nightmare of its own kind. I had to testify in detail about years of abuse, facing defense attorneys, who tried to paint me as a troubled teenager making up stories for attention. My father's lawyer suggested that I had been a willing participant, that I had somehow seduced grown men into these acts. The process was re-traumatizing in ways I hadn't anticipated, but I also experienced something I had never felt before. People believed me. The prosecutor, a stern woman named Ms. Chen, treated me with dignity and respect. The judge listened to my testimony with obvious compassion. For the first time in my life, adults were taking my word over the word of the men who had hurt me. Mr. Crawford was sentenced to 25 years in prison. My father received 8 years for child endangerment, conspiracy, and acting as an accessory to multiple counts of child sexual abuse. Several other men received shorter sentences or plea deals. The community reaction was swift and brutal. Our family became pariahs overnight. Neighbors who had once waved from their front porches now crossed the street to avoid us. My mother lost her job at the church daycare. My brothers, who had known nothing about what was happening in our basement, faced harassment at school and eventually dropped out. My mother never forgave me for speaking up. In her mind, I had destroyed our family, ruined our reputation, and sent her husband to prison over something that should have remained private family business. She made it clear that I was no longer welcome in our home. At 17, I found myself essentially orphaned, living with a foster family while I finished high school. The Johnsons were kind people who had been fostering teenagers for over a decade. They didn't ask intrusive questions about my past, but they provided stability, safety, and the first unconditional love I had experienced since early childhood. Mrs. Johnson helped me apply for college scholarships, and in the fall of 1970, I enrolled at Ohio State University in Columbus with financial aid that covered most of my expenses. I chose to study social work, driven by a desire to help other children who might be trapped in situations like mine. College was both liberation and struggle. I was free from the immediate threat of abuse, but I carried the psychological wounds like invisible shrapnel. I had panic attacks in crowded spaces, couldn't bear to be touched by anyone, and struggled with relationships of any kind. I threw myself into my studies, partly because I was genuinely passionate about the work, and partly because staying busy was the only way to keep the nightmares at bay. It was during my junior year that I met David, a fellow social work student who would become my husband and the father of my children. David was gentle in ways I hadn't known men could be. He never pressured me, never pushed for information about my past, never made me feel unsafe or threatened. Our relationship developed slowly, built on friendship and mutual respect rather than passion or romance. I told David about my childhood abuse before we became serious. I needed him to understand why I flinched at unexpected touches, why I couldn't sleep without checking all the locks twice, why certain smells or sounds could send me into a panic. His response was everything I had hoped for and nothing I had expected. "Angel," he said, holding my hands gently in the student union cafeteria, where I had finally found the courage to share my story. "Thank you for trusting me with this. I can't imagine how much strength it took to survive what you went through, and I'm honored that you're willing to share your life with me." We married in a simple ceremony the summer after graduation. No family attended from my side. My mother had maintained her position that I was a traitor who had destroyed our family, and my brothers had largely cut contact with me after our father's imprisonment. David's family welcomed me warmly, though I never told them the details of why my own family was absent. Daniel was born in 1975, and holding my son for the first time was a moment of pure terror mixed with overwhelming love. This tiny, perfect human being was completely dependent on me for protection, and I was terrified that I wouldn't know how to keep him safe. The experience of becoming a mother forced me to confront my own childhood trauma in new ways. I became hyper-protective, perhaps overly so. I researched every babysitter extensively, never left Daniel alone with anyone I didn't trust completely, and developed an almost psychic ability to read the intentions of every adult who came into contact with my son. David was patient with my anxieties, understanding that they came from a place of deep trauma rather than irrationality. As Daniel grew, I watched for signs of abuse with the vigilance of a hawk. I taught him about body safety from the earliest age, using age-appropriate language to explain that his body belonged to him and that no adult should ever ask him to keep secrets about touching. I created the kind of open, communicative relationship with my son that I had desperately needed, but never received from my own parents. The work of healing was slow and often painful. I started therapy when Daniel was 3, finally ready to address the deep psychological wounds that I had been carrying for over a decade. My therapist, Dr. Harrison, specialized in childhood trauma and helped me understand that the coping mechanisms I had developed to survive my abuse were now interfering with my ability to live fully. We worked together for several years, unpacking the layers of damage that had been done to my psyche. I learned that the hypervigilance that had protected me as a child was now causing chronic anxiety and exhaustion. The emotional numbing that had helped me endure years of abuse was now preventing me from experiencing joy and connection. The deep shame I carried about what had been done to my body was affecting my marriage and my sense of self-worth. One of the most difficult realizations was understanding the full scope of my father's betrayal. As a child, I had focused primarily on the men who directly abused me, seeing them as the primary villains in my story. But as an adult and a parent myself, I began to understand the unique horror of what my father had done. He was supposed to be my protector. Every child deserves parents who will fight tigers to keep them safe, who will sacrifice anything to shield them from harm. Instead, my father had literally sold access to my body, trading his daughter's safety and innocence for money, status, and social connections. The betrayal was so profound that it took years of therapy to even begin to process it. My mother's complicity was almost as devastating. She had chosen willful ignorance over her daughter's well-being, prioritizing her marriage and social standing over my safety. When I finally confronted her during my recovery process, her response was unchanged from what it had been during my childhood. "You always were a dramatic child," she said when I called her on Daniel's 5th birthday, hoping that becoming a grandmother might have softened her heart. "Always making up stories to get attention. Your father is a good man who made some mistakes, and you destroyed his life over nonsense." I hung up the phone and never called her again. Some relationships cannot be salvaged, no matter how much we might wish otherwise. The healing process was not linear. There were setbacks, periods of depression, times when the old coping mechanisms would resurface under stress. But there were also breakthroughs, moments of clarity, and gradual improvements in my ability to trust, to love, and to feel safe in the world. When Daniel was 8, we decided to have another child. Sarah was born in 1983, a daughter who would grow up in the safety and love that I had been denied. Raising a daughter brought up new fears and new determination. I was going to break the cycle of abuse that had defined generations of women in my family. Sarah would know her worth, would trust her instincts, would never doubt that she deserved protection and respect. As my children grew, and I continued my work as a social worker, I began to find my voice as an advocate for other survivors. I started speaking at conferences about childhood trauma, wrote articles for professional journals, and eventually began training other social workers about the signs and effects of childhood sexual abuse. In the late 1980s, I started a support group for adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. We met in the basement of a local church, a location that I had to overcome significant psychological resistance to use, given my own associations with basements. But I was determined not to let my abusers control any more of my life than they already had. The support group grew into a nonprofit organization that provided counseling, legal advocacy, and educational resources for survivors and their families. We called it Phoenix Rising because we wanted to emphasize the possibility of emerging from the ashes of trauma transformed and powerful. Through Phoenix Rising, I met hundreds of other survivors over the years. Each story was unique, but the patterns were depressingly familiar. Children betrayed by the adults who should have protected them. Families that prioritized reputation over safety. Communities that turned away rather than confront uncomfortable truths. And survivors who carried shame and guilt for crimes that had been committed against them. But I also witnessed incredible resilience, courage, and healing. I saw survivors who had been written off by everyone in their lives go on to become advocates, artists, parents, teachers, healers. I saw people transform their deepest wounds into sources of strength and compassion. I learned that while trauma changes us forever, it doesn't have to define or destroy us. My father was released from prison in 1984 after serving 6 years of his 8-year sentence. He never tried to contact me, for which I was grateful. I heard through distant relatives that he had moved to another state and taken a job under a different name. My mother remained in Riverside until her death in 2001, maintaining to the end that I had ruined our family with my lies and attention-seeking behavior. Mr. Crawford died in prison in 1991, stabbed by another inmate who had learned the nature of his crimes. I felt no satisfaction when I heard the news, only a kind of hollow relief that he would never hurt another child. By the time I turned 14, the weight of my secret had become unbearable. I carried it with me everywhere like a stone in my chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think about anything else. The basement sessions with Mr. Crawford and the rotating cast of my father's friends had become more frequent and more violent. What had started as inappropriate touching when I was 8 had escalated into acts so horrific that I still cannot speak them aloud without feeling that familiar numbness creeping over my body. I had learned to dissociate completely during those times, floating somewhere near the water-stained ceiling tiles while my body endured what it had to endure. Sometimes I would imagine I was a bird, soaring high above the cornfields that surrounded Riverside, free and untouchable. Other times I would recite multiplication tables in my head, or spell difficult words backward, anything to keep my mind occupied while my body was being violated. The physical damage was becoming harder to hide. I had chronic pain in places no 14-year-old should hurt. I bled sometimes, and had infections that I treated with stolen medicine from the drugstore, too terrified to see a doctor who might ask questions I couldn't answer. My sleep was fitful and filled with nightmares that left me exhausted during the day. But it was the psychological damage that was truly destroying me. I had begun to believe what Mr. Crawford whispered in my ear during those basement sessions, that I was worthless, that I was damaged goods, that no one would ever love me if they knew what I really was. He had convinced me that I was somehow responsible for what was happening, that my body's involuntary responses meant that I wanted these things to happen. My father's role in perpetuating this lie was perhaps the most devastating aspect of my entire ordeal. After each session, he would find me afterward, usually while I was trying to clean myself up in the small bathroom off our kitchen. He would pat my shoulder with the same hands that had just counted money or shaken hands with my abusers, and he would deliver the same message every time. "You're such a good girl, Angel. You make your old man proud. Mr. Crawford and his friends think very highly of you, you know. Not every father is lucky enough to have a daughter who understands how important it is to help the family." Help. The family. That's how he framed it, as if subjecting his daughter to systematic sexual abuse was some kind of civic duty, some noble sacrifice that I was making for the greater good. He had twisted the narrative so completely that for years, I actually believed I was being helpful, that enduring these horrible violations was somehow my contribution to our household. The money Mr. Crawford paid my father had allowed us to buy a newer television, to get our car repaired when it broke down, to afford small luxuries that other families in our neighborhood couldn't manage. My suffering had a direct monetary value, and my father made sure I understood that our family's improved circumstances were the result of my willingness to please his friends. My mother's willful blindness became more pronounced as I entered my teenage years. She developed an almost supernatural ability to be absent whenever the men were coming over. She would suddenly remember urgent errands that needed to be run, church meetings that required her attendance, or visits to relatives that couldn't be postponed. Her timing was always perfect, and her absence was always convenient. On the rare occasions when she was forced to acknowledge that something was amiss, her responses became increasingly hostile. One morning I came upstairs from a particularly brutal session with Mr. Crawford and two of his associates, my nightgown torn and bloodied, my face swollen from being slapped repeatedly for crying too loudly. My mother was standing at the kitchen sink, washing dishes with mechanical precision, her back rigid with tension. She didn't turn around when I entered the kitchen, but I saw her shoulders tighten when she heard my bare feet on the linoleum. "Mama," I whispered, my voice hoarse from screaming that had been muffled by hands and other things I don't want to remember. "Mama, I need help." She continued washing the same plate over and over, scrubbing it with a violence that suggested she was trying to clean away more than food residue. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat and cold. "What you need, Angel, is to stop causing problems for this family. Your father works hard to put food on this table and a roof over our heads. The least you can do is show some appreciation for the opportunities he provides." Opportunities. She called being systematically raped by adult men opportunities. That was the moment I understood with crystalline clarity that my mother was not going to save me. She was not going to protect me. She was not going to acknowledge what was happening to me. She had made her choice, and it wasn't me. At school, I continued to fade into the background, becoming increasingly invisible to teachers and classmates alike. My grades had plummeted from A's and B's to C's and D's. I stopped participating in class discussions, stopped raising my hand, stopped engaging with the world around me in any meaningful way. I was present in body, but absent in spirit, going through the motions of being a student while my real life happened in the shadows. Mrs. Thompson, my 9th grade English teacher, noticed the change in my behavior and made several attempts to reach out to me. She was a young woman, probably in her late 20s, with auburn hair and green eyes that seemed to see more than most adults bothered to look for. "Angel, you used to love reading," she said one afternoon after keeping me behind when the bell rang. "Your essays in 8th grade were some of the most insightful I've ever seen from a student your age. But this year, you seem like you're somewhere else entirely. Is everything all right at home?" The question hung in the air between us like a bridge I was too terrified to cross. I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to collapse into her arms and sob out the truth about what my father was allowing to happen to me. I wanted to show, Her the bruises that decorated my ribs, the bite marks that covered my shoulders, the evidence of what Mr. Crawford's friends had done to me the night before. But my father's warnings echoed in my head with the persistence of a church bell. If you ever tell anyone about our private business, bad things will happen to your mother. Bad things will happen to your brothers, and nobody will believe you. Anyway, because why would respectable men like us want anything to do with a lying little slut? The word slut had become his favorite term for me, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone commenting on the weather. He used it so frequently that I began to believe it was my name, my identity, my fundamental nature. I was not Angel Thompson, daughter and student and human being deserving of love and protection. I was a slut, a thing to be used, a commodity to be traded for favors and cash. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Thompson," I lied, staring at my hands folded in my lap. "I'm just tired lately." She looked at me for a long moment, and I could feel her trying to see through the walls I had built around myself. But she was bound by the same social conventions that protected my abusers, the assumption that parents love and protect their children, the belief that families handle their own problems privately, the reluctance to interfere in domestic situations without clear evidence of wrongdoing. "Well," she said finally, "if you ever need someone to talk to, my door is always open. Sometimes it helps to have an adult perspective on things that seem overwhelming." I nodded and mumbled my thanks, then hurried out of her classroom before she could ask any more questions that I couldn't answer honestly. The abuse continued to escalate throughout my freshman year of high school. Mr. Crawford had grown bolder and more demanding, sometimes bringing multiple associates to our basement meetings, sometimes keeping me down there for hours at a time. He had also begun taking photographs with increasing frequency, using an expensive camera that he kept in a leather case. "These are just for our private collection," he would tell me as he positioned my body in ways that maximized my humiliation and his access. "Beautiful girls like you should be preserved for posterity. Someday you'll be old and ugly, and these pictures will be all that's left of your youth and beauty." The concept of beauty became forever contaminated for me during those years. I began to hate my developing body, to see my emerging curves as weapons being used against me. I started wearing baggy clothes, stopped brushing my hair, tried to make myself as unattractive as possible in the desperate hope that if I could become ugly enough, the men would lose interest. But the abuse had nothing to do with beauty or attraction. It was about power, control, and the sick pleasure that certain men derive from dominating and destroying innocence. No amount of self-neglect or deliberate uglification could protect me from their appetites. My relationship with my brothers became increasingly strained during this period. Tommy and James were 5 and 7 years older than me, respectively, and they were beginning to suspect that something was wrong in our household. They couldn't miss the frequent visits from my father's friends, the closed basement door, the muffled sounds that sometimes escaped despite everyone's efforts to keep things quiet. Tommy, who was 19 and working at the same factory as my father, confronted me one evening after a particularly noisy session that had involved 4 men and had lasted well past midnight. "Angel, what the hell goes on down there?" he demanded, cornering me in the kitchen while I tried to make myself a peanut butter sandwich with shaking hands. "Every time Dad's buddies come over, you disappear into the basement for hours. And when you come back up, you look like you've been hit by a truck." I couldn't meet his eyes. The bruises on my throat were barely concealed by the high collar of my sweater, and I knew that my split lip was obvious despite my attempts to cover it with makeup I had stolen from my mother's dresser. "We just play cards," I whispered, the lie tasting like poison in my mouth. "Sometimes the games get a little rough." Tommy stared at me for a long moment, his expression shifting from confusion to suspicion to something that might have been understanding. He was young, but he wasn't stupid. He could see the fear in my eyes, the way I flinched when he moved too quickly, the careful way I held my body as if every movement caused pain. "Angel," he said, his voice gentler now, "if someone is hurting you, you can tell me. I'm your brother. I'll protect you." For a moment, I almost believed him. For a moment, I considered telling him everything and letting him try to save me. But then I remembered my father's warnings, remembered the casual violence with which Mr. Crawford and his friends treated anyone who got in their way, remembered how thoroughly my mother had abandoned me to my fate. "Nobody's hurting me, Tommy," I said, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. "You're being paranoid." He didn't believe me, but he also didn't push the issue. Like everyone else in my life, he chose the comfortable lie over the terrible truth. It was easier to pretend that nothing was wrong than to confront the reality of what was happening under our own roof. James, my other brother, took a different approach. He simply started staying away from the house as much as possible, spending his evenings with friends or at his girlfriend's house. He never asked questions about what went on during my father's gatherings, but his absence spoke volumes about what he suspected and his inability to deal with it. The isolation was complete and devastating. I was surrounded by people who knew something terrible was happening to me, but no one was willing to acknowledge it, much less try to stop it. I felt like I was drowning in plain sight while everyone around me pretended not to notice that I was going under. It was during the spring of my sophomore year that I finally reached my breaking point. Mr. Crawford had brought 3 associates to our basement that night. Men I had never seen before who were rougher and more violent than his usual companions. They had been drinking heavily, and their inhibitions were completely gone. What they did to me that night crossed every line that had previously been maintained. They hurt me in ways that left permanent physical damage, ways that no amount of dissociation could protect me from experiencing. When they were finished with me, I couldn't walk properly for days. I bled for over a week. And for the first time since the abuse began, I truly believed I might die from what they had done to my body. My father found me the next morning, curled, up on the basement floor where they had left me, still in my torn nightgown, barely conscious and burning with fever from the infection that was already setting in. For a moment, I saw something that might have been guilt or horror flash across his face, but it was quickly replaced by the same callous indifference he had shown me for years. "Clean yourself up and get to school," he said, tossing a dirty towel in my direction. "And keep your mouth shut about last night. Those men have important connections, and I don't want any trouble because you can't handle a little rough play." Rough play. He called what they had done to me rough play. That was the moment something fundamental shifted inside me. The last vestiges of the little girl who had trusted her father, who had believed that family meant safety and protection, finally died that morning on the basement floor. I cleaned myself up as best I could and went to school. But I was no longer the same person who had gone to sleep in her own bed the night before. Something had crystallized inside me, a kind of cold determination that I had never felt before. I was going to survive this. I was going to find a way out. And I was going to make sure that the men who had destroyed my childhood paid for what they had done. The plan formed slowly over the following weeks. I began paying attention to details I had previously tried to block out. I memorized the names and faces of every man who participated in my abuse. I noted the license plate numbers of their cars. I started keeping a journal hidden in my school locker, documenting dates, times, and details of what was done to me. I also began researching options for getting help. This was 1967, and resources for abused children were virtually non-existent, especially in small towns like Riverside. But I discovered that there was a crisis hotline in Columbus, about an hour away, that was staffed by volunteers who had been trained to help people in desperate situations. It took me 3 weeks to work up the courage to call that number. I used the payphone outside Murphy's Tavern after school one afternoon, feeding in quarters I had saved from my lunch money, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial the numbers. "Crisis hotline. This is Linda," said a warm female voice, on the other end of the line. "How can I help you today?" The words stuck in my throat for a moment. After years of enforced silence, it felt almost impossible to speak the truth aloud, but I forced myself to begin. "My name is Angel," I whispered, into the phone, looking around nervously to make sure no one was listening. "I'm 15 years old, and my father has been letting his friends hurt me for years. I don't know what to do anymore." "Oh, sweetheart," Linda said, her voice full of compassion. "I'm so sorry that's happening to you. You're very brave for calling. Can you tell me more about your situation?" For the next 20 minutes, I poured out my story to this stranger on the phone. I told her about Mr. Crawford, about the basement, about my father's complicity and my mother's willful blindness. I told her about the money that changed hands, the threats that kept me silent, the escalating violence that was destroying my body and my spirit. Linda listened without judgment, asking gentle questions to clarify details, expressing appropriate horror at what I described, and validating my experiences in ways that no one in my life ever had. "Angel, what you're describing is serious criminal activity," she told me when I finished. "These men are not just hurting you, they're committing multiple felonies. And your father is guilty of child endangerment and possibly trafficking. None of this is your fault, and you deserve protection and justice." The word justice hit me like a physical blow. For so long, I had accepted that what was happening to me was somehow normal, or at least unavoidable. The idea that there might be consequences for my abusers, that the legal system might actually protect children like me, was almost too much to hope for. "But what if no one believes me?" I asked, voicing the fear that had kept me silent for so long. "Mr. Crawford and his friends are respected men in our community. My father always says no one would take the word of a child over theirs." "Angel, that's exactly what abusers want you to believe," Linda said firmly. "They want you to think you're powerless, that you have no voice, that no one will help you. But that's not true. There are people whose job it is to protect children. And there are laws that make what's happening to you illegal, regardless of how respected your abusers think they are." She gave me the names and phone numbers of social workers and police officers in my area who had been trained to handle cases like mine. She explained my rights as a minor, the legal protections available to me, and the process of reporting abuse to authorities. "The most important thing to remember," she said as our conversation was winding down, "is that you have already taken the hardest step by reaching out for help. Everything else is just logistics. You are not alone anymore, Angel. There are people who will fight for you." I hung up the phone feeling both terrified and hopeful for the first time in years. The prospect of telling my story to police officers and social workers was frightening, but it was also liberating. I was no longer going to be trapped in my father's house, subjected to the appetites of his friends, forced to endure violations that were destroying my body and soul. But first, I needed evidence. I needed proof that would be impossible for my abusers to deny or dismiss, and I knew exactly how to get it. The next time my father announced that Mr. Crawford and his associates would be visiting, I was ready. I had borrowed a small tape recorder from the school's audio-visual department, claiming I needed it for a history project. I hid it in the basement earlier that day, tucked behind some boxes where it wouldn't be easily spotted but where it would pick up everything that happened. That night, I endured one final session of abuse, knowing it would be the last time these men would ever touch me. As they violated my body in ways that still make me nauseous to remember, I focused on the small red recording light, blinking in the darkness, capturing every word, every threat, every casual discussion of my body, as if I were livestock being evaluated. Mr. Crawford was particularly talkative that night, perhaps emboldened by the presence of two new associates he was clearly trying to impress. He described in graphic detail what he planned to do to me, laughed about how my father was smart to monetize his assets, and even mentioned other children in the area who might be brought into the fold if their parents could be properly motivated. When they were finished with me and had returned upstairs to drink with my father, I retrieved the tape recorder with trembling hands. I had done it. I had proof that no one could dismiss or explain away. I had their voices, their words, their admissions of guilt recorded on magnetic tape. The next morning, I called in sick to school and used the payphone at the bus station to contact Detective Morrison, one of the officers Linda had recommended. I told him I had evidence of ongoing child abuse and asked if I could meet with him that afternoon. Detective Morrison was a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes who listened to my story with the seriousness it deserved. When I played him the tape recording, his expression grew increasingly grim. By the time it was finished, his hands were clenched into fists and there was a muscle jumping in his jaw. "Angel," he said, turning off the tape player and looking directly at me. "This recording is going to change everything. What these men did to you is unconscionable, and they're going to pay for it. But I need you to understand that once we start this process, there's no going back. Your life is going to change dramatically, and it's going to be difficult in ways you might not be prepared for." I nodded, feeling calmer than I had in years. "Detective Morrison, my life can't get worse than it already is. Whatever comes next has to be better than what I've been living through." He smiled at me then, an expression of respect and admiration that I had never seen directed toward me before. "You're an incredibly brave young woman, Angel. What you've done today is going to protect not just you, but other children who might have become victims of these men. You should be proud of yourself." Proud. It was not an emotion I had much experience with, but sitting in that police station with evidence of my abuser's crimes in hand, I felt something that might have been the beginning of pride stirring in my chest. Within hours, Detective Morrison had assembled a team of officers and social workers. They obtained search warrants for Mr. Crawford's apartment and several other locations. They prepared arrest warrants for my father and his associates. And they arranged for me to be placed in protective custody, away from the people who had been hurting me for so long. That evening, as I watched through the window of a social worker's car, police officers led my father away in handcuffs. His face was a mask of rage and disbelief, as if he couldn't understand how his carefully constructed system of abuse and silence had finally collapsed. My mother stood in the doorway watching him being loaded into a police car, her expression unreadable. When she spotted me in the social worker's car, our eyes met for a moment. I saw no relief that her daughter was finally safe, no regret for the years of willful blindness, no acknowledgement that justice was finally being served. Instead, I saw accusation, resentment, and blame. In her mind, I was not a victim who had finally found the courage to seek help. I was a traitor who had destroyed our family for reasons she refused to understand or acknowledge. That look told me everything I needed to know about my future relationship with my mother. Just as my father had chosen his friends and their money over his daughter's safety, my mother was choosing her husband and her denial over her daughter's well-being. I was an orphan in every way that mattered, but for the first time in my life, I was also free. The foster home where I was placed after my father's arrest felt like stepping into an alien world. The Rodriguez family lived in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Columbus, surrounded by maple trees and a garden where Mrs. Rodriguez grew tomatoes and peppers. Everything about their home was the opposite of what I had known. Warm lighting instead of harsh fluorescence, family photos on the walls instead of bare spaces, the smell of homemade bread instead of cigarette smoke and fear. Elena and Miguel Rodriguez had been fostering teenagers for 12 years. They had raised 6 children of their own, all now adults, and had opened their home to dozens of kids who needed temporary shelter while the legal system sorted out their lives. They were in their early 50s, both soft-spoken and patient, in ways that seemed almost supernatural to someone who had grown up with violence and chaos. My first night in their home, I sat on the edge of the single bed in what they called Angel's room, staring at the clean white walls and trying to process the silence. For the first time in 8 years, I went to sleep knowing that no one would wake me in the middle of the night. No one would call my name and expect me to go downstairs. No one would hurt me while I was vulnerable and defenseless. But instead of relief, I felt a kind of suspended terror. My body had been trained to expect violation, and the absence of immediate danger felt wrong somehow, like a trap waiting to spring. I lay awake most of that first night, listening for footsteps on the stairs, for the sound of my bedroom door opening, for the familiar voices of men who saw me as nothing more than an object for their entertainment. The legal proceedings began almost immediately. Detective Morrison had assembled a task force that included FBI agents, since some of Mr. Crawford's associates had crossed state lines to participate in what was now being investigated as an organized child trafficking ring. The evidence from my tape recording had led to search warrants that uncovered photographs, films, and documents, proving that my abuse was part of a much larger operation. My father, Robert Thompson, was charged with multiple counts of child endangerment, conspiracy to commit sexual abuse, and acting as an accessory to human trafficking. Mr. Crawford faced dozens of charges including rape, sexual abuse of a minor, production of child pornography, and racketeering. Several other men were arrested in connection with the case, including Pastor Williams from our church, which sent shockwaves through the entire community of Riverside. The discovery that a respected religious leader had been participating in the systematic abuse of children created a scandal that made headlines throughout Ohio. Suddenly, my story was no longer a private family matter that could be swept under the rug. It was front-page news, complete with photographs of the defendants being led away in handcuffs and speculation about how many other children might have been victimized. Elena Rodriguez sat with me at their kitchen table the morning the first newspaper article was published, her gentle hands folded over the offensive headlines. Angel, mija, I want you to know that none of this is your fault. Not what happened to you, not the pain your family is going through, not the embarrassment your community is feeling. You are the victim here, and you are the hero for having the courage to speak up. The word hero felt strange applied to me. I had never thought of myself as brave or heroic. I had simply reached a point where survival required action, where staying silent would have meant dying, either literally or spiritually, but Elena's words planted a seed in my mind, the beginning of a different narrative about my own story. The trial preparation was grueling in ways I hadn't anticipated. I spent hours with prosecutors, going over every detail of my abuse, reliving traumatic memories that I had worked hard to suppress. The district attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Williams, was thorough and relentless in her pursuit of justice, but she was also kind in her interactions with me. Angel, I know this is difficult, she would say during our preparation sessions, but your testimony is going to be the key to putting these men away for a very long time. Every detail you can remember, every piece of evidence you can provide, is going to help protect other children from going through what you experienced. The defense attorneys, however, were brutal. They employed every tactic possible to discredit my testimony and character. They painted me as a troubled teenager who had fabricated these stories for attention. They suggested that I had been a willing participant in sexual activities and was now crying rape because I regretted my choices. They brought up my declining grades, my withdrawn behavior, my lack of close friendships as evidence that I was mentally unstable and unreliable. Most devastating of all, they convinced my mother to testify on behalf of my father. Margaret Thompson took the witness stand wearing her best Sunday dress and testified that I had always been a difficult child, prone to lying and attention-seeking behavior. She claimed that my accusations were the result of jealousy over the attention my father gave to his friends, and that I was trying to destroy our family because I resented not being the center of attention. Sitting in that courtroom and listening to my own mother describe me as a malicious liar who had invented years of sexual abuse for attention was one of the most painful experiences of my entire ordeal. It was worse than any physical violation. I had endured because it represented the final, complete abandonment by the person who should have loved and protected me unconditionally. But the evidence was overwhelming. The tape recording I had made captured not only the voices of my abusers, but also their casual discussions of payment schedules, their references to other children they were planning to recruit, and their detailed descriptions of acts that matched exactly with my testimony. The photographs and films found in Mr. Crawford's apartment provided visual proof that corroborated everything I had said. When the verdicts were announced, the courtroom was packed with reporters, law enforcement officials, and members of the watch community who had followed the case. Mr. Crawford was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. My father received 25 years for his role in the conspiracy. Pastor Williams was convicted of multiple counts of child sexual abuse and sentenced to 30 years. Several other defendants received sentences ranging from 10 to 20 years. The judge, an elderly man named Harold Foster, addressed me directly before announcing the sentences. Ms. Thompson, your courage in coming forward and testifying about these horrific crimes has not only brought justice for yourself, but has protected countless other children who might have become victims of this criminal enterprise. The court wants you to know that you are a survivor and a hero, and you should never let anyone convince you otherwise. As I walked out of that courthouse for the final time, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was relief that justice had been served, satisfaction that my abusers would be spending decades in prison, and validation that the legal system had believed my testimony over their denials. But there was also grief for the childhood that had been stolen from me, anger at the adults who had failed to protect me, and uncertainty about what my future would hold. The media attention following the trial was intense and largely unwelcome. Reporters wanted to interview the brave teenager who exposed a child trafficking ring. Television shows wanted me to appear and tell my story. Publishers approached me about writing a book, but I was barely 16 years old, still processing my own trauma and completely unprepared for the spotlight that my courage had thrust me into. Elena and Miguel Rodriguez protected me from most of the media requests, screening calls, and turning away reporters who showed up at their door. They understood that what I needed was not more attention, but time and space to heal from the years of abuse I had endured. The healing process was neither linear nor simple. I started therapy with Dr. Margaret Chen, a psychologist who specialized in childhood trauma and had experience working with survivors of sexual abuse. Our sessions took place in a comfortable office with soft lighting and plants, a space that felt safe and private in ways that were still foreign to me. Dr. Chen helped me understand that the coping mechanisms I had developed to survive my abuse, the dissociation, the emotional numbing, the hypervigilance, were adaptive responses that had protected me but were now interfering with my ability to live normally. She taught me grounding techniques to help me stay present in my body, breathing exercises to manage anxiety attacks, and cognitive strategies to challenge the negative thoughts about myself that my abusers had planted in my mind. One of the most difficult aspects of therapy was learning to trust my own perceptions and feelings. For 8 years, I had been told that my reality was wrong, that my pain didn't matter, that my experience of being violated was somehow my fault or my imagination. Even after the trial had vindicated my testimony, I struggled to believe that. My own thoughts and emotions were valid. Angel, you have spent years learning not to trust yourself because your survival depended on accepting other people's version of reality, Dr. Chen explained during one of our sessions. Now you have to learn to trust yourself again. Your feelings are real. Your memories are accurate. Your pain is valid. You are the expert on your own experience. School became a refuge during this period. I had missed significant portions of my sophomore year due to the investigation and trial, but the administration at Columbus East High School worked with me to catch up on my coursework. My teachers were aware of my situation. It was impossible to keep it secret after all the media coverage. But they treated me with dignity and respect rather than pity or sensationalism. Mrs. Anderson, my English teacher, became particularly important in my recovery process. She recognized that I had always been a strong writer, and she encouraged me to use writing as a way to process my experiences. She introduced me to authors who had written about trauma and survival: Maya Angelou, Sandra Cisneros, Toni Morrison, women who had transformed their pain into powerful art. "Writing can be a form of healing, Angel," she told me one afternoon after class. "It can help you make sense of what happened to you, and it can also help other people who have gone through similar experiences feel less alone." I started keeping a journal during this time, writing about my memories, my feelings, my hopes for the future. Sometimes the words came easily, pouring out of me like water from a broken dam. Other times, I would stare at a blank page for hours, unable to articulate the complexity of what I was feeling. But the act of writing itself became therapeutic, a way of taking control of my own narrative after years of having my story told by other people. My relationship with the Rodriguez family deepened over the months I lived with them. Elena became the mother figure I had never had, offering unconditional love and support without asking for anything in return. She taught me to cook traditional Mexican dishes, helped me shop for clothes that made me feel confident rather than invisible, and listened patiently when I needed to talk about my fears and dreams. Miguel was the first positive male role model I had ever had. He was gentle and respectful in all his interactions with me, never raising his voice or making sudden movements that might trigger my trauma responses. He showed me what healthy masculinity looked like: strength used to protect rather than harm, authority exercised with compassion rather than cruelty. Their adult children welcomed me into the family with warmth and acceptance. Rosa, their youngest daughter who was away at college, came home for Christmas that year and immediately treated me like a sister. She helped me pick out a dress for the school winter formal, taught me how to apply makeup in ways that enhanced rather than concealed, and shared stories about her own teenage struggles that made me feel less alone. But even in this loving environment, I struggled with basic trust and intimacy. I flinched when people touched me unexpectedly, even in friendly gestures. I had panic attacks in crowded spaces where I felt trapped or unable to see all the exits. I couldn't sleep with my bedroom door closed, and I kept a bag packed under my bed in case I needed to run away quickly. The Rodriguez family understood these behaviors and accommodated them without making me feel ashamed or broken. They left my bedroom door open at night and checked on me periodically without making a big deal about it. They warned me before hugging me or touching my shoulder. They made sure I always knew where the exits were in any building we entered together. Despite their patience and love, I knew that living with them was temporary. Foster care was designed to be a short-term solution while permanent arrangements were made. My 18th birthday was less than 2 years away, and I would need to be prepared to live independently as a legal adult. The thought of being completely on my own was terrifying. I had never learned basic life skills like managing money, maintaining an apartment, or navigating adult relationships. My childhood had been spent surviving rather than preparing for adulthood, and I felt woefully unprepared for the responsibilities that were approaching. Elena sensed my anxiety about the future and sat down with me one evening to discuss my options. "Angel, mija, you have several paths available to you. You could stay with us until you graduate high school and then go to college with financial aid. You could get job training in a field that interests you. You could join a program that helps foster kids transition to independent living. The most important thing is that you don't have to figure this out alone." The idea of college had never seemed realistic during my childhood. My father had always dismissed education as a waste of time for girls, insisting that my only value was in my ability to please men and serve their needs. But now, surrounded by people who believed in my intelligence and potential, higher education began to seem not just possible but essential. I threw myself into my studies with the intensity of someone who understood that education was my ticket to a different kind of life. I worked with tutors to catch up on the math and science concepts I had missed during my worst periods of abuse. I read voraciously, making up for years when reading had felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. I participated in extracurricular activities that helped me develop social skills and leadership abilities. My grades improved dramatically. By the end of my junior year, I was earning A's in most of my classes and had been inducted into the National Honor Society. Teachers began talking to me about scholarships and college applications. The guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, worked with me to identify schools that had strong support programs for students from traumatic backgrounds. During this time, I also began to think about what I wanted to do with my life beyond just surviving. For years, my only goal had been to endure each day and hope that somehow the abuse would stop. Now, for the first time, I could imagine a future where I had agency, purpose, and the ability to help other people. The idea of working with children who had experienced trauma appealed to me strongly. I understood their fear, their confusion, their reluctance to trust adults who claimed they wanted to help. I knew what it felt like to be completely powerless, in the hands of people who were supposed to protect you. And I believed that my own experience could be valuable in helping other young survivors navigate their recovery. Dr. Chen encouraged this interest, but she also cautioned me about the emotional challenges of working with trauma survivors. Angel, your personal experience could be a tremendous asset in this field, but it could also be triggering and re-traumatizing if you're not careful. You would need to be very far along in your own healing process before you could effectively help others with theirs. I understood her concerns, but I also felt a strong sense of purpose emerging from my pain. The abuse I had suffered was terrible and inexcusable, but if I could use that experience to help other children escape similar situations, then perhaps some meaning could be salvaged from the horror. As my senior year approached, I began the college application process with the help of Mrs. Patterson and Elena. We focused on schools that had strong social work or psychology programs, good financial aid packages, and supportive environments for students with non-traditional backgrounds. Ohio State University emerged as the top choice. It was close enough that I could maintain my relationship with the Rodriguez family, but far enough away that I could establish my independence. The scholarship applications required me to write essays about my background and goals. For the first time since the trial, I found myself writing publicly about my experiences with abuse and my hopes for the future. It was difficult to distill 8 years of trauma and 2 years of recovery into a few pages, but the process helped me clarify my own understanding of how my past connected to my future aspirations. One essay prompt asked me to describe a challenge I had overcome and how it had shaped my character. I wrote about the night I made the tape recording that led to my father's arrest, and how that experience had taught me that speaking truth to power was both terrifying and essential. I wrote about learning to trust again in the Rodriguez household, and how their love had shown me what healthy relationships could look like. I wrote about my dreams of becoming an advocate for children who had no voice of their own. The acceptance letter from Ohio State arrived on a gray February morning during my senior year. Elena was the first person I told, running into the kitchen with the letter clutched in my shaking hands. She read it over my shoulder, then pulled me into a hug. That felt like coming home. "I'm so proud of you, mija," she whispered into my hair. "You have turned your pain into purpose, your trauma into strength. Your abusers thought they could destroy you, but instead you have become more powerful than they ever imagined." As graduation approached, I reflected on how much my life had changed in the 3 years since I had made that terrifying phone call to the crisis hotline. I was no longer the broken, frightened girl who had been systematically violated in her father's basement. I was still healing, still learning to trust, still working through the complex emotions surrounding my childhood trauma. But I was also strong, determined, and hopeful about my future in ways that would have been impossible to imagine during the darkest periods of my abuse. The Rodriguez family threw a small graduation party for me, inviting Dr. Chen, Mrs. Anderson, Mrs. Patterson, and a few close friends I had made during my time at Columbus East. It was the first celebration of my accomplishments that had ever been held in my honor, and I was overwhelmed by the love and support surrounding me. As I prepared to leave for college that fall, Elena helped me pack my belongings, now considerably more than the single suitcase I had arrived with 3 years earlier. We folded clothes, packed books, and organized the small mementos I had collected during my time with their family. "Angel," Elena said as we worked, "I want you to know that this will always be your home. No matter where life takes you, no matter what challenges you face, you will always have a family here who loves you unconditionally." I hugged her tightly, tears streaming down my face. "Elena, you saved my life. All of you did. You showed me what love looks like, what family can be. I will never forget that." As I drove away from the Rodriguez house toward my new life at Ohio State University, I carried with me not just my belongings, but also the love, strength, and wisdom that had been given to me by people who chose to care for a broken teenager when they had no obligation to do so. I was ready to begin the next chapter of my recovery, knowing that I had been forever changed by the kindness of strangers who had become family. College life at Ohio State University opened up a world I had never imagined possible. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who knew nothing about my past, who saw me simply as Angel Thompson, freshman psychology major, rather than the girl whose father had sold her to his friends. The anonymity was both liberating and terrifying. I could reinvent myself completely, but I also felt disconnected from the hard-won strength that had emerged from my survival. I threw myself into my studies with an intensity that surprised even my professors. Psychology fascinated me in ways that went beyond academic curiosity. Every theory about human development, every case study about childhood trauma, every research paper about resilience felt personally relevant. I was studying my own experience through an academic lens, trying to understand not just what had happened to me, but why people like my father and Mr. Crawford did the things they did. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, my developmental psychology professor, noticed my exceptional performance and asked me to stay after class one afternoon during my sophomore year. She was a woman in her 40s with intelligent brown eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, someone who radiated the kind of competent warmth that made students feel comfortable sharing their thoughts. "Angel, your papers demonstrate an unusual depth of insight into trauma and recovery," she said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Have you considered specializing in this area? There's a great need for researchers and practitioners who truly understand the impact of childhood abuse." I felt my cheeks burn with a mixture of pride and anxiety. My academic success felt like a betrayal of the broken girl I had once been, as if excelling in my studies somehow minimized the reality of what I had endured. But Dr. Martinez's recognition also validated my growing sense that my experiences could be transformed into something meaningful. "I have been thinking about it," I admitted. "But sometimes I wonder if I'm too close to the subject matter. If my own history might interfere with my ability to help others objectively." Dr. Martinez leaned forward, her expression serious but kind. "Angel, some of the most effective trauma therapists and researchers are people who have personal experience with the issues they study. Your lived experience, combined with rigorous academic training, could make you extraordinarily effective at helping survivors. The key is making sure you're far enough along in your own healing to maintain appropriate boundaries." Her words planted a seed that would grow throughout my remaining college years. I began volunteering at a local crisis center, answering phones and providing support to people in emergency situations. The training was intensive, covering everything from suicide prevention to domestic violence response, but I felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from my life since the trial ended. My personal life during college remained complicated. I had difficulty forming close friendships, still struggling with the hypervigilance and trust issues that were the legacy of my childhood abuse. I went on a few dates with classmates, but physical intimacy remained deeply problematic for me. The moment any relationship moved beyond casual conversation and light touching, my body would freeze up and my mind would flood with traumatic memories. There was one young man, Marcus, a junior studying social work, who seemed to understand my limitations without requiring detailed explanations. We studied together, went to movies, shared meals in the cafeteria, but he never pushed for more physical contact than I was comfortable with. His patience and respect helped me begin to believe that healthy relationships might be possible for someone with my history. "Angel, you don't owe anyone an explanation for your boundaries," he told me one evening as we walked across campus after a study session. "Whatever happened to you before we met, it doesn't define who you are now. You're one of the strongest people I know." His kindness touched something deep inside me, but it also triggered a familiar panic. People who got too close to me had a way of being hurt by the darkness I carried. I began pulling away from Marcus, canceling plans and avoiding places where I might run into him. It was easier to be alone than to risk contaminating someone else's life with my trauma. During my junior year, I received news that would shatter the fragile peace I had built around my new identity. Elena Rodriguez called me on a Tuesday evening in October, her voice tight with worry and anger. "Angel, mija, I have something difficult to tell you. Robert is being released from prison next month. His sentence was reduced for good behavior, and he's served 15 years of his 25-year term." The phone slipped from my hand, clattering onto my dormitory floor. My father, the man who had sold my childhood to his friends, was going to be free. The man who had stood at the top of the basement stairs counting money while Mr. Crawford and his associates violated his daughter was going to walk out of prison and resume his life as if nothing had happened. I retrieved the phone with shaking hands. "Elena, does he know where I am? Has he tried to contact me?" "No, mija. There's a restraining order that prevents him from contacting you directly. But Angel, you need to be careful. Men like your father often become obsessed with the people they blame for their downfall. He spent 15 years in prison thinking about what you did to him, not what he did to you." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my dorm room, feeling the familiar tendrils of fear creeping back into my consciousness. For 6 years, I had been building a new life based on the assumption that my abusers were safely locked away, unable to hurt me or anyone else. Now that safety was an illusion, and I was forced to confront the possibility that my past might not be as buried as I had hoped. I started taking different routes to class, checking over my shoulder constantly, jumping at unexpected sounds. The hypervigilance that I had worked so hard to overcome in therapy came roaring back with a vengeance. I stopped going to social events, avoided being alone after dark, and even considered transferring to a university in another state. Dr. Chen, my therapist, whom I had continued seeing during college breaks, helped me process these renewed fears during an emergency session over winter break. "Angel, it's completely normal for you to feel anxious about your father's release. But remember that you're not the same powerless child you were when he was arrested. You're an adult now, with resources and support systems and legal protections. You have agency in this situation." Her words were logically sound, but emotionally, I felt like I was 12 years old again, waiting for the basement door to open and my nightmare to resume. I increased my therapy sessions, started taking a self-defense class, and even considered purchasing a gun for protection. The semester passed without incident. My father made no attempt to contact me, and gradually my anxiety began to subside. I threw myself back into my studies and volunteer work, determined not to let his freedom derail the progress I had made. But in the back of my mind, I remained constantly aware that he was out there somewhere, free to rebuild his life while the scars he had inflicted on mine would last forever. It was during the spring semester of my senior year that my carefully constructed sense of security finally collapsed. I was walking back to my dorm from the library late one evening, my backpack heavy with books for my senior thesis on childhood trauma recovery, when I noticed a figure following me at a distance. At first, I thought it was paranoia. I had been jumpy for months since learning of my father's release. But as I turned several corners and changed my route, the figure continued to maintain the same distance behind me. My heart began racing, and I ducked into a well-lit coffee shop that stayed open 24 hours. Through the window, I watched the figure approach under a streetlight, and my blood turned to ice. It was my father, Robert Thompson, looking older and grayer than I remembered, but unmistakably the man who had destroyed my childhood. He stood across the street, staring directly at the coffee shop where I was hiding, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had found me. Despite the restraining order, despite the distance I had put between my new life and my old one, despite all my precautions, he had tracked me down. The message was clear. He could get to me whenever he wanted, wherever I went, however hard. I tried to hide. I called campus security from the coffee shop, but by the time officers arrived, my father had disappeared. They took my statement seriously and increased patrols around my dormitory, but they also made it clear that until he actually violated the restraining order by approaching or contacting me directly, their options were limited. Miss Thompson, we understand your concerns, and we'll do everything we can to keep you safe, the head of campus security assured me. But right now, he hasn't technically broken any laws. Being in the same city as you isn't a violation of the restraining order. The cat and mouse game continued for several weeks. I would catch glimpses of him across campus, always at a distance that couldn't be considered a legal violation, always. With that same cold smile that let me know he was watching and waiting. He was playing psychological warfare, trying to break down my defenses and drive me into isolation and fear. The stress was devastating. My grades began to slip as I struggled to concentrate on anything other than scanning my environment for threats. I stopped eating regularly, lost weight I couldn't afford to lose, and developed chronic insomnia that left me exhausted and emotionally raw. Marcus, who had remained a supportive friend despite my attempts to push him away, noticed my deteriorating condition and confronted me one afternoon in the library. "Angel, you look terrible. What's going on? And don't tell me you're just stressed about graduation." For the first time since college began, I told someone about my history. I explained about the abuse, the trial, my father's recent release, and the stalking that was currently terrorizing me. Marcus listened without judgment, his expression growing increasingly grim as I revealed the extent of what I had endured. "Angel, this is serious. You can't handle this alone. Have you contacted the police about his stalking behavior?" I had, but the legal system that had once protected me now seemed frustratingly inadequate. My father was careful to stay just within the boundaries of what was technically legal, and without clear evidence of threatening behavior, law enforcement was limited in what they could do. The situation reached a breaking point on a rainy Thursday evening in April. I was leaving my evening statistics class when I found my father waiting by my car in the parking garage. He was standing close enough that I couldn't reach my vehicle without coming within arm's length of him, close enough that his presence constituted a clear violation of the restraining order. "Hello, Angel," he said, his voice exactly as I remembered. It, deep, authoritative, with an undertone of casual cruelty. "You've grown up to be quite the little crusader, haven't you? Destroying families, sending good men to prison, playing the victim when you were nothing but a little whore who enjoyed every minute of it." The words hit me like physical blows, each one designed to transport me back to the basement where I had been helpless and voiceless. For a moment, I felt my adult self slipping away, replaced by the terrified child who had learned to endure whatever was done to her body. But then something inside me hardened. I was not that child anymore. I was 22 years old, educated, strong, and surrounded by people who loved and supported me. I had survived his abuse once, and I was not going to let him victimize me again. "You're violating the restraining order," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm calling the police." He laughed, the same harsh sound that used to echo down the basement stairs. "Go ahead, little girl. Tell them your daddy came to see you. Tell them how scared you are of the man who gave you life, who put food in your mouth and clothes on your back. Tell them how you repaid his kindness by destroying his reputation and sending him to prison." I pulled out my cell phone and dialed 911, keeping my eyes fixed on his face as I reported the violation. His expression shifted from amusement to anger as he realized I was serious about involving law enforcement. "You always were an ungrateful little bitch," he snarled, taking a step closer to me. "I should have let Crawford and his friends do whatever they wanted with you. Maybe then you would have learned some respect." The police arrived within minutes, their flashing lights illuminating the parking garage as they surrounded my father. I watched from a safe distance as they handcuffed him and read him his rights, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness as the man who had terrorized my childhood was led away once again. This time, the violation of the restraining order was clear and documented. My father was charged with stalking, harassment, and violation of a court order. The judge who heard his case was unsympathetic to his claims that he was simply trying to reconnect with his daughter, especially given the extensive documentation of his previous crimes. "Mr. Thompson, you were prohibited from any contact with your daughter for good reason," Judge Patricia Morrison said during his sentencing hearing. "Your behavior over the past several months demonstrates that you remain a threat to her safety and well-being. This court sentences you to 2 years in prison for violation of the restraining order, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, during which you are forbidden from entering the same county where your daughter resides." As I watched my father being led away in shackles for the second time in my life, I felt a sense of finality that had been missing after his first conviction. This time, I had not been a helpless child dependent on adults to protect me. I had been the one to call for help, to stand up to his intimidation, to refuse to be victimized again. Walking out of that courthouse, I realized that the frightened girl who had made a tape recording in her father's basement was truly gone. In her place was a woman who understood her own strength, who would not be silenced or intimidated, who had transformed her trauma into a source of power rather than shame. The remaining weeks of my senior year passed quickly. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in psychology and acceptance to graduate school for a master's program in clinical social work. The ceremony was attended by Elena and Miguel Rodriguez, Dr. Chen, Marcus, and several professors who had become mentors during my undergraduate years. As I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. From the basement where my childhood innocence had been destroyed to the courthouse steps where I had reclaimed my power, every experience had shaped me into the person I was becoming. My father's final attempt to intimidate me had failed spectacularly. Instead of breaking me down, it had shown me how far I had traveled from the victim I used to be. I was ready for the next phase of my life, confident in my ability to not only survive whatever challenges lay ahead, but to help other survivors find their own paths to healing and empowerment. Graduate school at Case Western Reserve University marked the beginning of my transformation from survivor to healer. The clinical social work program was rigorous and demanding, requiring not only academic excellence, but also deep personal reflection about why we were drawn to this profession. During our first week, Professor Janet Sterling posed a question that would haunt me throughout my studies. "What brings you to this work, and what do you hope to accomplish?" I sat in that classroom surrounded by bright-eyed students who spoke passionately about wanting to help others, about social justice, about making a difference in the world. When my turn came to share, I found myself speaking words I had never said aloud before. I want to be the adult I needed when I was a child. I want to make sure no child ever feels as alone and powerless as I once did. The silence that followed my statement was profound. Some of my classmates looked uncomfortable, others seemed moved, but Professor Sterling nodded with understanding. After class, she approached me with a gentle smile. "Angel, I can tell you have a story that led you here. If you're willing to share it with me sometime, I'd be honored to listen. That conversation became the first of many that would shape my graduate school experience. Professor Sterling became not just an academic mentor, but a guide who helped me understand how to transform personal pain into professional purpose without losing myself in the process. She introduced me to the concept of wounded healers, practitioners who use their own experiences of trauma and recovery to better serve their clients. My field placement was at the Children's Advocacy Center in Cleveland, where I worked with children who had experienced abuse and neglect. The first time I sat across from an 8-year-old girl who couldn't make eye contact and spoke in whispers, I saw myself at that age. The recognition was both painful and empowering. I knew exactly what she was feeling because I had been in her shoes. Working with these children required me to confront my own trauma in new ways. Each case brought up memories and emotions I thought I had processed, but I discovered that healing is not a destination, but an ongoing journey. I continued therapy throughout graduate school, now focusing on how to maintain healthy boundaries, while using my personal experience as a therapeutic tool. The most challenging case came during my second year. A 14-year-old named Jessica had been trafficked by her stepfather to his friends, a situation that mirrored my own experience, so closely that I initially wondered if I should request a different assignment. But something in Jessica's eyes, a combination of rage and despair that I recognized intimately, told me I might be uniquely positioned to help her. Our first session was difficult. Jessica sat curled in the corner of my office, hostile and defensive, refusing to speak beyond single-word answers. I didn't push her to talk about her trauma. Instead, I shared something I had learned from my own experience. Jessica, I want you to know that whatever happened to you wasn't your fault. Adults who hurt children are skilled at making their victims feel responsible, but the blame belongs entirely to them. Something shifted in her posture at those words. She looked at me directly for the first time, and I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. "How do you know?" she asked quietly. "Because someone hurt me too when I was your age, and it took me years to understand that I wasn't responsible for what adults chose to do to me." That moment of connection became the foundation of our therapeutic relationship. Over the following months, Jessica began to share her story, and I was able to guide her through the process of reporting her abuse and testifying against her perpetrators. Watching her find her voice and reclaim her power reminded me why I had chosen this path. During my final year of graduate school, I met Dr. Kevin Harrison at a conference on childhood trauma. He was a renowned researcher who had developed innovative treatment protocols for young survivors of sexual abuse. When he offered me a position as a research assistant after graduation, I jumped at the opportunity to contribute to the broader understanding of trauma and recovery. Working with Dr. Harrison introduced me to the academic side of trauma work. We published papers on resilience factors in child abuse survivors, developed screening tools for identifying at-risk children, and created training materials for professionals working with traumatized youth. The research was fulfilling, but I missed the direct client contact that had drawn me to social work in the first place. It was during this period that I met James, the man who would become my husband. He was a pediatric nurse at Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital, where I conducted research interviews. James was gentle and patient, with an easy laugh and a natural way with children that immediately attracted me. Unlike previous relationships, our connection developed slowly and organically, built on shared values and mutual respect. When I finally told James about my childhood abuse, his response was everything I had hoped for, but had been afraid to expect. He listened without judgment, thanked me for trusting him with my story, and assured me that my past only made him admire my strength more. "Angel, you could have let what happened to you make you bitter and closed off. Instead, you've chosen to dedicate your life to helping other children. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." We married in a small ceremony at the Rodriguez family home, with Elena walking me down the aisle since I had no father to fill that role. The wedding was simple but deeply meaningful, surrounded by the chosen family who had supported me through my darkest times and celebrated my victories. James and I decided to start our own family, a decision that brought up complex emotions about my ability to protect a child given my own traumatic history. Our son Michael was born in 2003, and holding him for the first time was simultaneously the most joyful and terrifying moment of my life. Looking at his perfect, innocent face, I made a silent vow that he would grow up knowing he was loved, protected, and valued for exactly who he was. Becoming a mother intensified my commitment to child protection work. I left the research position and opened a private practice specializing in trauma therapy for children and adolescents. My office was designed to be the antithesis of every frightening space from my childhood: bright, welcoming, filled with soft furniture and art supplies, with multiple exits clearly visible. Word spread quickly about my effectiveness with particularly challenging cases. Parents brought me children who had been labeled difficult or resistant to treatment by other therapists. What they didn't understand was that these children weren't being difficult, they were being protective of themselves in the only ways they knew how. My approach was different from traditional therapy models. I never pressured children to talk about their trauma before they were ready. Instead, I focused on building trust, teaching coping skills, and helping them understand that they were not responsible for what had been done to them. Sometimes healing happened through play therapy, sometimes through art, sometimes through simple conversations about their favorite movies or books. One of my most memorable clients was a boy named David who had been severely abused by his uncle. He came to me after 2 years of unsuccessful therapy with other providers, completely shut down and refusing to engage with any adult. During our first session, he noticed a small scar on my hand from an old injury and asked how I got it. "I got hurt when I was young," I told him honestly. "But it healed, and now it's just a reminder that I survived something difficult." He studied the scar for a long moment, then looked at me with new interest. "Do you have other scars?" "I do. Some you can see and some you can't, but they're all part of my story, and they remind me how strong I am." That conversation opened the door to a therapeutic relationship that would span 3 years, and ultimately help David process his trauma and rebuild his ability to trust. Watching him graduate from high school and head off to college with a full scholarship was one of the proudest moments of my career. As my practice grew, I began training other therapists in trauma-informed care. I developed workshops on recognizing the signs of abuse, creating safe therapeutic environments, and understanding the unique needs of trafficking victims. My personal experience gave weight to my professional expertise in ways that purely academic training could not. In 2010, I received a call that would change the trajectory of my advocacy work. A producer from a national news program had heard about my practice and wanted to interview me for a segment on childhood sexual abuse. Initially, I was reluctant to go public with my story on such a large scale, but James encouraged me to consider the potential impact. "Angel, think about how many children might be helped if their parents or teachers see your interview and recognize signs of abuse. Think about how many survivors might find hope in your story." The interview was terrifying, but powerful. I spoke about my childhood trauma, my journey to healing, and my current work with young survivors. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of emails from survivors thanking me for giving voice to their experiences, from parents asking for guidance about concerning behaviors in their children, from professionals requesting training on trauma-informed practices. That interview led to speaking engagements across the country. I addressed conferences of social workers, law enforcement officers, educators, and medical professionals. Each time I shared my story, I emphasized the same core messages. Children who disclose abuse should always be believed, survivors can heal and thrive with proper support, and early intervention can prevent lifelong trauma. My second child, Sarah, was born in 2008, and watching my children grow up in safety and love continued to fuel my passion for protecting other children. Michael and Sarah knew age-appropriate versions of my story. They understood that Mommy worked with children who had been hurt by adults, and that helping these children was very important to our family. The work was emotionally demanding, requiring constant attention to my own self-care and mental health. I maintained regular therapy sessions, took vacations with my family, and cultivated interests outside of trauma work. James was an unwavering source of support, understanding when I came home emotionally drained and celebrating with me when difficult cases reached successful resolutions. In 2015, I established the Angel Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing comprehensive services to child abuse survivors. The foundation offered therapy, legal advocacy, educational support, and emergency assistance to children and families affected by abuse. We also funded research into innovative treatment approaches and provided training for professionals working with traumatized youth. The Foundation's first major initiative was a prevention program for schools, teaching children about body safety, appropriate boundaries, and how to seek help if someone made them uncomfortable. The program reached thousands of children in its first year, and early evaluations suggested it was effective in increasing reporting of inappropriate behavior by adults. As I approached my 60th birthday, I began to reflect on the journey that had brought me from a terrified child in a basement to a respected advocate and healer. The pain of my childhood would always be part of my story, but it no longer defined me. Instead, it had become the foundation for a life dedicated to protecting innocence and nurturing resilience. My father died in prison in 2016, alone and unvisited. I felt no satisfaction at his passing, only a quiet sense of closure. The man who had tried to destroy me had ultimately failed. I had built a life filled with love, purpose, and meaning despite his attempts to break me. Today, at 72, I continue my work with renewed energy. My children are adults now. Michael is a teacher who works with at-risk youth, and Sarah is studying to become a child psychologist. They both carry forward the values of protection, compassion, and justice that have guided our family. The foundation has expanded to serve multiple states, helping thousands of children and families heal from trauma. We've prevented countless cases of abuse through our education programs and trained hundreds of professionals in trauma-informed practices. Looking back on my life, I am amazed by the power of human resilience. The little girl who was betrayed by the very people who should have protected her grew up to become a protector of other children. The pain that once felt unbearable became the source of my greatest strength. My story is not just about surviving abuse. It's about the possibility of transformation, the power of chosen family, and the importance of speaking truth even when it's difficult. Every child I've helped, every professional I've trained, every survivor who has found hope in my story represents a victory over the forces that tried to silence me. The basement where my childhood innocence was stolen is long gone, demolished, years ago when the house was torn down. But the strength I found in that darkness remains, lighting the way for other survivors who are still finding their voices, still learning to trust, still discovering that they are worthy of love and protection. That is my legacy, not the trauma that was inflicted on me, but the healing I have chosen to create from that pain. And every day, I wake up grateful for the opportunity to turn my deepest wounds into a source of hope for others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.